Hello children. Today we will discuss chapter 2 of history, Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. Today we will discuss the third part of this chapter. The topics under discussion today are the February Revolution in Petrograd, the abdication of the Tsar from power, events after February 1917, the rise of the Bolshevik under Lenin, the revolution of October 1917, the events that occurred, and how the Bolshevik got control over Moscow-Petrograd area. In the last class, we had discussed about the huge Russian Empire in 1914, the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II, the economy and society under the Tsar, that is, the workers of the industries and the peasants in the countryside, how they united in times of strikes, the spread of socialism in Russia, the 1905 revolution, which was popularly called the Bloody Sunday incident, the First World War and the involvement of Russia in it, the impact of World War I on Russia and how it had a severe impact on the economy of Russia. This is what was discussed in the last class. To take it forward, we will begin with the conditions in the city of Petrograd. The city of Petrograd, the way it was planned, reflected the divisions of the society then. The Winter Palace, the official buildings, and the palace where the Duma met were all located on the left of the river Neva. The workers' quarters and the factories were on the right bank. In that particular year, 1917, Petrograd experienced a severe winter. There was exceptional frost and heavy snow. Acute food shortages among the workers added to their already existing problems. The parliamentarians were desperate to preserve the elected government. At the same time, the Tsar was determined to dissolve the Duma so that his authority would go unchecked. In these conditions, a storm was brewing. In February 1917, there were many events that occurred which we will discuss day-wise. On the 22nd of February, there was a lockout at a factory. On the 23rd, the workers in 50 factories called for a strike, and here we see for the first time there was a lot of women participation. Women who were a major workforce in the industries joined this strike, and at that point of time, this day was celebrated as International Women's Day then. Of course, now we celebrate it in March. So, in 1917 February, things began on the 22nd and we will see how it continued thereafter. Demonstrating workers at Nevsky Prospect, which was the center of the capital, surrounded the fashionable quarters, the rich people of that area, as well as the official buildings. These demonstrators had to be dealt with only with the government imposing a curfew. On the 24th of February, the demonstrators come back to their place of protest. And here, in order to bring order, the government calls for the cavalry and the police. On the 25th, the Duma is suspended, and we see that on the 26th, the demonstrators return again in full force. But this time, the government finds it difficult to bring things under their control. The Nevsky Prospect becomes the main eye of all activities. On the 27th of February, the police headquarters are ransacked. The people on the streets start raising slogans: bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. These were the demands of the people. The government calls for the cavalry, but again here we see that it is not the same as before. Even the cavalry refuses to fire, and various regiments see mutiny. These people join hands with the striking workers. The police, the workers join hands to form a Soviet, which is an association. So, the Petrograd Soviet is formed, and they meet at the same place where the Duma met. Following this, the military commanders advise the Tsar to abdicate, to give up his position on the throne. So on the 2nd of March, the Tsar abdicates on the advice of the military commanders. This was an end of the Romanov dynasty in power. As monarchy ends in Russia, Russia sees a new phase. Russia is run by the provisional government, which has members of the Soviet and the Duma. So the Soviet and the Duma leaders, they form the provisional government, and there is a lot of emphasis and demand for a constituent assembly in Russia, elected on the basis of universal adult franchise. The provisional government meets and is ready to take over the charge of Russia. The provisional government had members from different classes, and here we see that the army officials, the landowners, and the industrialists slowly extend their influence over the decisions that the provisional government takes. Here, the liberals and the socialists want an elected government. Slowly, the ban that had been placed on public meetings and the formation of associations are removed. So, Soviets are set up everywhere. There are Soviets of soldiers, Soviets of workers, so basically associations of all kinds. Here we see the entry of Lenin, who had been exiled from Russia for his active participation in the political activities that were happening. So he returns from Russia in April 1917 to take on the leadership of the Bolsheviks. He presents the April thesis, which demands that war should be brought to a close, the land of the noble should be transferred to the peasants, and banks and industries to be nationalized. Lenin also puts forth that the Bolshevik Party should be renamed as the Communist Party. Here, other Bolshevik members oppose to his views, saying that it was not yet time for a socialist revolution to take place. It was a time when the provisional government needed to be supported in order to bring about stability to the country. Throughout the summer this year, the country experiences winds of change. There is a spread of workers' movements. Soldiers' committees are formed in the army. Factory committees and trade unions grew in number, and the factory owners were questioned about the way they ran their factories. In some places, workers also are aggressive to take up on the operation of the factories. All this was not appreciated by the provisional government. So, we see that the Bolsheviks' power slowly increases and the provisional government's power reduces. With every passing day, the Bolshevik influence on the people became stronger with Lenin's leadership. The Bolsheviks carry out various demonstrations in different parts of the city, and the provisional government leaves no stone unturned to deal sternly with these demonstrations. Meanwhile, we see that in the countryside, the peasants demand that land should be redistributed. For the purpose of redistribution of land, land committees were formed. Socialist revolutionaries become active in mobilizing support from the peasants. During the period July to September in 1917, the peasants in the countryside seized the lands by force. So, the revolution of October 1917 was underway as the conflict between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks grew. It was the Bolsheviks who were planning how to execute the revolution of 1917. Lenin wanted that the provisional government power should be checked, as the provisional government was slowly becoming dictatorial. So, discussions begin to plan for an uprising against the provisional government. We need to remember here that monarchy had ended and the provisional government was formed with the membership of the members of the Soviet and the Duma leaders. So this provisional government was now facing opposition from the Bolshevik party. So the Bolsheviks were planning to put an end to the provisional government. The Bolshevik supporters in the army, the Soviets, and the factories came together to plan action. On the 16th of October 1917, it was decided that the Bolshevik party and the Petrograd Soviet would plan to seize power. There would be a socialist seizure of power. So, a military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet to organize the seizure under Leon Trotsky. Seeing all this, the provisional government also had to keep themselves ready for this assault. Measures were taken by the provisional government in order to deal with the Bolsheviks. Prime Minister Kerensky, alarmed at what would happen next, summons troops into the city. the buildings of Bolshevik newspapers are seized and the pro-government troops move over to protect the telephone and telegraph office and the Winter Palace where the provisional government met. So, although Kerensky took various steps to deal with the Bolsheviks, nevertheless the Bolsheviks were successful in their plan. The Military Revolutionary Committee ordered the seizure of government and arrest of the ministers. The Winter Palace is shelled from the ship Aurora. Other vessels take up various military points in the river Neva, and by nightfall ministers surrender and the city comes under the control of the Military Revolutionary Committee. So, we see that the beautiful Winter Palace of the Romanov dynasty is shelled and finally is stormed, just like the Bastille was stormed during the French Revolution. And as history goes, the ship Aurora was the one which blank fired in order to signal to the Bolsheviks to begin action. With the takeover of the Bolsheviks and the overthrow of Kerensky from power, Russia was definitely going through a massive change. The All-Russian Congress of Soviets meeting in Petrograd approve of the Bolshevik action and uprising, and similar actions start taking place in other cities. By December 1917, the Bolsheviks are in complete control over the Moscow-Petrograd area. So, this is how we see the October Revolution having come out successful and the Bolsheviks in complete control of Russia. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they brought in many changes which reflected their ideology. Banks and industries were nationalized. Big houses were partitioned according to the number of members a family had. The old titles of aristocracy which had been awarded to the people, they were banned from using these titles. Land was declared as a social property. There were new uniforms for the army and the officials, and this was done especially to assert the other changes that were made by the Bolsheviks. So, a clothing competition was organized in 1918 and the Budanovka hat was chosen for the soldiers of Russia. So these were the major changes that the Bolsheviks brought about when they were in control of Russia. To sum up what we have discussed today, we began with the 1917 revolution in Petrograd, how the workers demanding bread, better wages and better conditions demonstrated at the Nevsky Prospect. This was the event which saw a large-scale participation of women, followed by the cavalry, the workers joining together to form the Petrograd Soviet. the Tsar abdicating on the advice of the military personnel, the formation of the provisional government by the Soviet and the Duma leaders, the Bolsheviks coming to power under the leadership of Lenin, the Bolsheviks staging the October 1917 revolution and bringing about changes that suited their purpose. Now we move on to the question and answers. The first one is, when did Tsar Nicholas II abdicate? 2nd of March 1917. Who formed the provisional government after the February 1917 revolution? It was the Soviet leaders and the Duma leaders. Who was the leader of the Bolshevik party? Vladimir Lenin was the leader of the Bolshevik party. When did Lenin return to Russia from his exile? Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917 from his exile. Who was put in charge of the Military Revolutionary Committee? Leon Trotsky was put in charge of the Military Revolutionary Committee. Who was the Prime Minister during the October 1917 revolution in Russia? Alexander Kerensky was the Prime Minister of Russia during the October 1917 revolution. That is all for today. We shall continue with the rest of the chapter in the next class. Thank you.